John Maxwell writes in his book, Failing Forward, he says, when I was growing up, one of the questions I used to hear from motivational speakers was this: if the possibility of failure were erased, what would you attempt to achieve? If you knew you couldn't fail, what would you try in life? Now think about that. Now Maxwell goes on to write, he says, I got thinking about that, but I realized that was really a bad question. Because it takes a person's thinking down a wrong track. It gets us thinking that maybe that we can have success in life, in business, in marriage, in parenting, with taxes, without failure. But the truth of the matter is that any journey we're on in life, to be successful, whatever it is, spiritually, our spiritual journey, whatever journey it may be, there are going to be failures along the way. That's just the way it goes. Maxwell goes on to say there is no achievement without failure. And so here's a better question that Maxwell asks. He said, if your perception and responses to failure were changed, what would you attempt to achieve? In other words, if we began to look at failure a little bit differently, what would we be willing to risk to try for God? What would we be willing to try to risk in life? What would we be willing to risk in relationship if we looked at failure differently? One of the problems with failure is that failure begins to become final in our minds. We begin to think of failure as if that is going to be the last word written about us. I remember when we were in Cuba, 6 or 7 years ago, John? How long has it been since we've been to Cuba? It's been a long time. We took a group of 8 in Cuba, came home with 3. No, we went down to Cuba for about 4 or 5 days, and then we were asked to minister in little house churches, and it was a great experience for me. I'd never done anything quite like that before. And I still remember the sermon that I spoke in Cuba. It was about Jesus rewriting the end of our story. What would happen if instead of fearing failure, we would trust God to rewrite the end of our stories if we fail along the way? Because the reality is we're going to fail along the way. I failed along the way. Most people will fail along the way. I think everybody fails at one point. What would happen if we really began to believe that failure was not final? Just like getting baptized, one of the reasons we're baptized is all the failure in our life gets washed away and stays in the water, so to speak. Because with God, failure is not final. We've been in the study of Joseph, a series called Living the Dream. And we've said a lot of things about Joseph, and we've learned a lot of things about Joseph. But I want to talk about a story this morning that's kind of stuck in the middle of Joseph's story that really, for years, to me, did not make sense. In Genesis chapter 37, Joseph is revealed by God, is given a dream, and he's going to be a great leader, and his brothers sell him into slavery, and he goes down into Egypt, and at the end of chapter 37, things aren't looking too great for Joseph. He's a good kid, but he made a few mistakes along the way, and he ends up in Egypt. And then we read in chapter 38 the story about a guy named Judah. It's his brother. Now, there couldn't be 2 different kinds of people in the world than Joseph and Judah. Whenever you look at the story of Joseph, you're going to find a man that at every turn he does the right thing. At every turn he makes a sacrifice. At every turn he puts other people first. At every turn the man does what he should do. He is a good man and he suffers for it. He does good and he suffers. He doesn't prosper right away, or he prospers and he has a rug pulled out from under him. On every hand, Joseph is a good man, and we never read in his life about anything other than how he handled his dreams when he was young. He doesn't really do anything wrong. And yet life just doesn't work out for him, at least for a long time. And then we read about a guy named Judah in chapter 38. And this might be one of the most bizarre stories in the Bible. In fact, there's parts of it I'm not going to read today, and I want you to go home and read because they're really kind of bizarre. But I want to give you the overall story here, and then we're going to say a few things about Judah's life. Judah is Joseph's brother, and after they sell Joseph into slavery, Judah is going to go down to a Canaanite town, and he's going to get married to a Canaanite woman. He's going to have 3 sons. And each of his sons, starting with the first, gets married, and then God kills them. You read the story for yourself. I don't quite understand all the details, but they're wicked people, and then they just die. And then you have the second brother, same thing happens, and then the third brother, Judah is so afraid of something bad happening to his other son that he promises his daughter-in-law, who was married to the other son, that when the youngest son gets old enough, he would give her to him in marriage. It's really strange. But it's something called a Levirate marriage. Back in the time of Jacob and Joseph, they didn't have, Social Security, didn't have programs like we have. And so one of the things that they did is if a young woman was widowed, she would be married by one of the relatives. That's the way they did it. But the reason they did it, because they didn't have that woman, if she didn't get married into the family somehow, would end up alone. She would end up poor and impoverished and would not survive. And so that was kind of the cultural system that they had if something bad really happened. And that's the story, that's the setup for the story that we read. And this is what happens to Judah. But we find out several things about Judah through this story. I would encourage you to read this story later, and if you go online, just type in Levirate marriage, and it'll explain it more in detail. But it says in Genesis 30, it says, it came to pass at that time, this is right after Joseph is put in Egypt, that Judah departed from his brothers and visited a certain Adullamite whose name was Hira. And Judah saw that there was a daughter of a certain Canaanite who was named Shua, and he married her, and they consummated the marriage. And then Judah took a wife, Erah's firstborn, and her name was Tamar. Now, here's what we find out about Judah in this chapter. Number one, Judah failed a lot. Judah didn't just fail, he failed a lot. John Townsend writes that failure has a way of becoming personal. It has a way of becoming pervasive. It has a way of becoming permanent. In other words, when we fail, we don't just fail. We have a tendency to make it personal. We say, I failed. We tend to bring it into ourselves and make it a character trait of who we are. Failure becomes a part of us. And then slowly, after time, failure begins not only to become part of us, it begins to become pervasive. Not only do I fail, we say to ourselves, we say, I fail at everything, or I fail at a lot of things. And it begins to spread until finally we begin to see ourselves as a failure, and then thirdly, failure becomes permanent. I will always fail. Now, if there was ever a person that failure should be personal, pervasive, and permanent, it should be Judah. This guy failed a lot. And I believe that this story is right smack dab in the middle of Joseph's story for a reason. There is a reason why God put it there. Because we're reading the life of Joseph and we're seeing how this man's going to live a dream. He's going to be a great leader. He's going to be a powerful man. He's going to have all this stature and all these things in his life. And if we're not careful, we begin to look at Joseph. And if we're not careful, we begin to say, I can never be a Joseph. And we begin to think that it's all about the Josephs in the world. We begin to think it's all about the great men. I'm not a Joseph. I relate more to a Judah, a guy who failed a lot, a guy that made a lot of mistakes, a guy that had a lot of gaffes, a guy that just didn't quite get it right. Judah failed a lot. And there's a backstory that God is trying to get us all to see, that it's not about the Josephs, it's about the Judahs. God is raising up Joseph not for Joseph's sake. He's raising him up for his boneheaded brother's sake. God doesn't raise up leadership. God doesn't raise up churches. He doesn't raise up things so that those that are raised up can get cocky and proud. He raises up. He does a work in a people for the sake of the people and also for the sake of the people that they will serve. Judah failed as a brother. How do I know this? If you go back and I don't have enough time this morning, but if you go back to Genesis chapter 37, 26 and 27, when his brothers decided they were going to throw Joseph in a pit and they were going to get rid of him, it was Judah, according to Genesis 37, 26 and 27, that came up with the bright idea. Hey, he's our brother. Let's make a buck on him. Let's not kill him. It was Judah. He failed as a brother. I have one brother And he never sold me into a pit. He may have beat the snot out of me a couple times, but he never sold me anywhere. This brother Judah makes a buck on his brother. Now, at the time, this probably seemed like a good idea. You ever have a good idea at the time, but later out it plays out that it's not such a bright idea? Let's make $1 on him. Let's sell him for 20 shekels of silver. Every one of them are going to get 2 shekels of silver. Let's make a buck. Sounds like a great idea. I remember a couple Christmases ago, I had the great idea that it was Christmas night and we were having a party at my sister's and the family was meeting. I had the bright idea that I was going to park in the parking spot on the grass away from the driveway so that when it was over, I could get out fast. And it was dark. And I didn't know that my sister just had her septic tank pumped that day. And I didn't know that they put the lid on, but they didn't close the hole in. I didn't know that it was on the way from where I parked into the front door of the house. And so I'm walking along and I fell in the hole. Seemed like a good idea at the time. I thought I broke my leg. The good news is I sued my sister and made $4,000. No, I didn't sue her, but boy, when I want something from her, I just go, oh. I'll never forget, I was about 12 years old. I was working with my father. My father was a plumber, and I was trying to learn the trade, and I wanted to be a big boy, and so it was back in those days, it wasn't plastic pipe, it was copper. Anybody remember those days? And so you had to light an acetylene torch, and then you had to heat the pipe, and you had a little, I forget what it was, that you'd solder around the pipe. And I said, Dad, will you let me light the acetylene torch? Seemed like a good idea at the time. So I took the thing, and I went, and I went the wrong direction. And that thing lit up my fingers. And for the whole rest of the day, I had to keep my hand in a bucket of water. Boy, did that hurt. Seemed like a good idea at the time. Judah said, let's make a few dollars off of our brother. Seemed like a good idea, but here's the problem. The memory lingered much longer than the money did. And for the next 22 years, Judah and his brothers were reminded of their failure. The problem with guilt, folks, is it makes our failure final. Jesus came to wash away our guilt. He came to wash away our failure. He came to leave it in the past. We all have failures in our lives. We all make mistakes. Man, if you go, in fact, I don't know if I even want to come to my retirement party because there's so many bloopers that they have of things that I've said over the years. I know they're going to play some of them. Part of us would like to watch, some of them are funny, some we just want to kind of go underneath the water and just stay there. Judah failed a lot. He failed as a son. It says he went down to Adullam. Now, for us, that's not a big deal. But it's a big deal in the Bible. Adullam was actually a low-lying area. Adullam is where David wrote the 23rd Psalm. It literally comes from a word that means to dangle on the end of your rope. That's what Adullam comes from in Hebrew. Judah's life, too many J's, Judah's life is going down. He doesn't even see it. When we sin against one another, folks, and Judah sinned against his father and his brother, Judah failed, it creates distance between us, emotional distance. And what Judah does, instead of staying in the presence of his father, he removes himself and he moves into the land of Canaan, and he distances himself physically from his father, and then he marries a Canaanite woman. That's not a big deal to us, but it's extremely forbidden, expressly forbidden in the scriptures for them to do that. Judah is going to marry the wrong woman. There's probably a lot of reasons why for that. I don't have time to go into it, but Judah's life is going down. He thinks he's making decisions based out of failures that have taken place, and now he's taking and making one decision after another, and it looks like his life is going down, and it is. Kind of reminds me of the story of Jonah, another J. Remember the story of Jonah? Read the book of Jonah. That's the second homework assignment. Read the book of Jonah and notice how many times it says he went down. God speaks to Jonah and says, Jonah, I want you to go preach to the Ninevites and tell them that judgment's coming because I want to save them. Jonah gets ticked off at God because he knows that God will forgive them. Read the story. And it says Jonah went down to Joppa. Jonah went down into a ship. Jonah went down into the belly of the whale. Jonah went down to the bowels of the earth. One mistake after another, and Jonah's life was going down. Judah's life was going down. In this story, he's making one mistake. Failure is becoming part of who he is. It's becoming pervasive and personal and permanent. He failed as a father. The story tells us in chapter 38, verses 3 through 11, that he promised to his daughter-in-law Tamar that she would marry the youngest son because she had lost 2 husbands already. But he never had any intentions of fulfilling that promise. By now, Judah is a man that has learned to hide his failure. Judah is a man that's going to do image management. Judah is a man that's not going to let the public see all the mistakes and all the failures that he had in his life. He's going to keep on a good front image. He learned to hide it well. In fact, that's another subplot in the book of Genesis. If you look at Genesis, there's several themes that run through it. One of them is mankind's propensity for hiding his failure. When Adam and Eve, it starts right in the Garden of Eden. What do? When God says, don't eat of the one tree, they eat of the one tree, they failed. What happens when God shows up? They hide amongst the trees of the garden. They're hiding their failure. That's what we do, folks. Every one of us in here have failed, and we've all probably failed a lot. And when we do, we like to hide it. We want to hold it to ourselves and not let other people see it. Then there's Abraham. Abraham goes down to Egypt, and his wife must have been a looker. She's 80 years old, and he's worried about Pharaoh taking her into his harem. Dude, she's got to be a Victoria's Secret model. Come on, work with me. And you know what he tells her? He says, look, you're so hot that Pharaoh's going to want to take you into his harem, and you need to tell Pharaoh that you're my sister. That way he won't kill me to get you. And that's what she did. And he hides behind the skirts of his wife because he's afraid. His son Isaac did the same thing. He passed it on to his kids. Hiding, folks, doing image management out of fear and out of failure and the things that happen in life. We hide. And Judah became excellent at it. Judah is going to become the poster child of hiding. In Genesis 37:27, back there, you're going to have to go back and forth in this story to see this. He says, come and let's sell him, for he is our brother. And he hides his greed behind a feeling of fraternity and brotherhood. He says, hey guys, we are brothers. Let's not kill him. Let's just make a buck. He hides his murderous intentions and acts behind a question with his father. The boys, we don't know which one of them came up with this idea, but they came up with the idea of dipping Joseph's garment in blood and showing their father. And they said, we have found this. Do you know whether it's your son's tunic or not? Folks, be careful of the news. They lead with a question. And they take us where they want us to go, and many times it ain't good. Hiding the truth. He hid his true intentions to his daughter-in-law. Remain a widow in your father's house till my son is grown. I don't believe the man ever intended. And in verse 24, here's how the story gets bizarre. Are we adults here? I'm going to keep it rated PG, but this is a bizarre story. Judah promised to his daughter-in-law that he would let her marry his son, and he doesn't fulfill his promise. And so she's getting older. And in that society, if you have no husband, as I said earlier, it can be pretty bad for you. And so one day she decides to take off because her husband was also taken away from her. And so she's got her widow garments on. She takes her widow garments on, and she's told that Judah is taking his flocks to be sheared. And so she dresses up like a prostitute, like a harlot, and goes to where Judah is getting his sheep sheared. And to make a long story short, they have a little rendezvous. It's bizarre. Now, in order for him to pay, he didn't have any money on him, so he says, what do you want so that I get what I want? And she says, I want your signet ring and your staff. And so Judah gives her his signet ring, which is a big deal. It's like giving her the key to the checking account, and her staff, and then, things happen, and then he goes home, she leaves, and she goes back, puts her widow garments on, and then 3 months later, they find out that she's pregnant by her father-in-law. Now, folks, don't look at me like that. This is in the Bible. Read it. It's bizarre. When I do a study, I don't know when, sometime in the future, I'm going to do a study on the life of Jacob. It's just bizarre. We think that God's people got it all together. The point of this story is that God's people fail. They're messed up like everybody else. But we want to hide our failure. We sometimes hide behind church. We hide behind our nice clothes, or we hide behind our success, or we hide behind our reputation. We have this thing where if we're not careful in church, we begin to think we might be not the failures everybody else is. And the truth of the matter is, we've all failed a lot. I wish I could say after 40 years of walking with Christ that I got it all together. But I don't, as my wife can attest. And now my mother-in-law can attest to that. Of course, I do have to live with 2 Toman women, so give me some slack. Judah hides his moral failure behind righteous indignation. Listen to this. And it came to pass about 3 months after that Judah was told, saying, Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has played the harlot. Furthermore, she is with child by harlotry. So Judah said, bring her out and let her be burned. I'm going to pray and close the service now. Folks, he's the one that got her pregnant. Now, here's the moral of the story. Judah failed a lot. Judah hid his failure, but Judah failed forward. Watch what happens. If you read this story, I don't have time to read it all, but read it, please. He goes on to say, she says, I'm pregnant by the man whose signet ring and staff this is. And Judah is exposed. Now, when we're guilty and feeling our failure, the last thing we want is to be exposed. But exposure will change Judah's life. Judah will be a changed man after this. The Bible goes on to say, she's more righteous than I am. And then the Bible says, and he knew her not again. Now, if you take this in the context of the Levirate marriage, what's happening here is Judah had every right, once his daughter-in-law was pregnant with his child, to take her into his home as his wife. That's how it worked. But he doesn't do that. He takes all the responsibility for her. He takes her into the family. Read the story. He becomes responsible for her. But for the first time in his life, this man who has used people, this man who has sold people, this man who was all about himself and hid his failures, hid his true intentions, hid everything that was ugly about him, this man has a change in his life. Something is changed when he is exposed for being a hypocrite. And he takes all the responsibility now, but he doesn't take any of the privileges. Now, I know this is bizarre to us, but this was culturally relevant then. Why? Why is this happening? This is a turning point in Judah's life. Now, let me just say for a disclaimer before I finish this sermon, that not everyone in the world and in this church or in a group are safe to share your failures with. You hear me, church? Some people's failure is gossip. You probably don't want to tell them. Why do you think I harp on community so much? We've got to get to know one another because we need to be able to share our secrets, but I would be very cautious who you share your secrets to. Chuck Swindoll tells of a friend who lost a son. He said they found the boy drowned at the bottom of the neighbor's swimming pool. He told Chuck, he said, shortly after the drowning, I got in my car and I drove the Los Angeles freeways for hours. As I did, I lashed out with words I would never say outside the car. No one else was there, and I just poured out all of my feelings, grief and resentment, anger and confusion. I dumped it all. After more than 2 hours of that, I drove back home and pulled into my driveway. I turned off the engine. My eyes and cheeks were still wet with tears. I laid my head against the steering wheel, completely exhausted. Then I was suddenly struck with a thought. God can handle this. You know the best part, he said? God will never tell on you. Isn't that great, he says? Isn't it a relief to know that the Lord God will never stand up in church and say, I'm here to announce what so-and-so said to me last Thursday night. Folks, the reason we hide our failure is we don't believe that if people really knew who we are, they would love us. And you know what? Some people won't. But God will. And what God is doing in Judah's life and what God is doing in all the other brothers' lives as we celebrate Joseph, as we say, look, he's the guy to emulate, what we can often lose is the reality that the only reason God raised up a Joseph was to get to a Judah. We failures are the reason God does what he does. Judah becomes a man from this point on that thinks about other people. There's something different about this man. And that's going to be important when we get into the rest of the story next week. But I just want to give this to you and then we'll close down. Sometime later, Joseph's brothers show up into Egypt, as we've been carrying in our series. And they bow before Joseph, and then Joseph plays this little trick on them, as we talked about last week. But the second time they return, and I don't have time to go into, I'll go on the whole story next week. But Judah is talking to his father about going back to the second time. They've already been to Egypt once, and they're afraid of Joseph, who's been acting meanly. And then Judah said to Israel, Israel is Jacob. He said, send the lad. Let me just recap. Benjamin, the youngest son, is in Egypt in jail. And they've come home to get grain, and Joseph said, don't come back to Egypt unless you bring your youngest brother with me. Now, Jacob, the father, is scared to death because he's already lost one son. He doesn't want to lose another one. We'll talk about that next week. But then Judah said to Israel, Israel is the name for Jacob. That's significant, as we'll see next week. Send the lad with me, and we will rise and go, that we may live and not die, both we and you and our little ones. I myself will be surety from him. From my hand you shall require it. If I do not bring him back to you and set him before you, then let me bear the blame forever. This is a changed man. This is a man that failed a lot. This is a man that hid his failure, but this is a man that failed forward. Listen to verse 33 of chapter 44. This is after a long things have happened. This is actually when Judah and his brothers are standing before Joseph. Joseph is playing out this thing like he's going to send them in jail or kill them. They're all scared to death. They don't know what to do. And Judah stands up and says, now therefore, please let your servant remain instead of the lad as a slave to my Lord. Now he's saying, I am willing to take Benjamin's place. I will give my life for his life. Something has happened in Judah's life. This man has failed forward. And the last thought is this. Genesis 49, verse 8. Jacob, the father, is on her deathbed. Are you following me? Or am I losing you? We good? Jacob, the father, is on his deathbed. Years have gone by. 17 years have gone by in Egypt. Jacob calls all his sons to gather around his bed because he's on his deathbed. Now you would think that when Jacob is going to prophesy over every one of his sons. And you would think that the one who's going to get the best prophecy, the one who's going to be the leader of the clan, the one that's going to be significant after Jacob's death would be Joseph. We've been studying the life of Joseph. He's the guy that saves them. He's the guy that goes to prison. He's the guy that's standing before Pharaoh. He's the man. And you would think that on his deathbed, with all the grace that Joseph had in his life, that Joseph would be the guy that was going to be exalted by God and his father. But guess who it is? It's Judah. Because Judah, even after all his failure, is going to live the dream. Listen to this. Judah, you are he whom your brothers shall praise. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's children, that would be the brothers, shall bow down before you. Judah's a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He bows down, he lies down as a lion, and as a lion, who shall rouse him? The scepter shall not depart from Judah. This is speaking of David and ultimately Christ. Nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh comes, Messiah. And to him shall the obedience of the people be. You know what that tells us, folks? Man, I could just go on, but I'll wear you out. Failure isn't final. God redeems failure. Judah failed a lot. Have you failed a lot? I have. Have you hidden your failure? I have. Are you ready to fail forward? I am. Living the dream is not about doing everything perfect on the journey. Living the dream is letting God do in your life what He wants to do. Father, I've said enough. You've been present in this service, though we don't deserve it. You're trying to encourage every one of us that the past is the past and we need to leave it behind. You're trying to remind all of us that, Lord, no matter where our journeys start, they can end different. And Lord, you're trying to tell us all that to live the dream, we have to stop fearing failure more than we trust in you. You're a great God. No, you don't want us to fail. You don't want us to make mistakes because they hurt. But Lord, you love us while we're failing, after we fail, when we're hiding it. You love us. And even when we're behind the curtain, you would say to us, your dream is still a reality and a possibility. Let me work in your life. Father, this morning I pray that every one of us would let you, not necessarily other people, because we can get hurt really bad if we let the wrong people behind the curtain. That is earned, Father. That's not a gift. People have to earn that trust. Where we start is opening the veil to you and saying, Lord, I really, really have failed. I'm messed up. And I really need your grace. I need some help. Lord, it's when that happens in our lives, there's a turning point. And it's that turning point that, Lord, begins us down the road to living the dream. Lord, help us to become a church filled with people that don't make excuses for sin or failure, that don't lower the bar, which is happening in a lot of places in our country. Help us to keep the bar. The bar tells us how we're doing. But may we become a church, a people of Judahs, redeemed from our failure. And because we've been redeemed, like Judah, Judah could now understand a lot of things and give a lot of grace because he received it. May we receive grace this morning, Father. May you bless your people. May we fail forward. In Jesus' name. And everybody said, amen and amen.